All right, so for the last portion of the day, we'll be having the discussion on divorce and real estate. So we have two great lawyers from Schwartz, Levine, and Kaplan. We actually have Schwartz and Kaplan here, so we got 2 out of 3. It's not too bad. And so we're starting off with Sandy Schwartz, who will get things started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sandy Schwartz. I am the co-managing partner of the real estate department and of Schwartz, Levine, and Kaplan. We are a boutique firm located here in Midtown, right by Penn Station at 7 Penn Plaza. My partner, Jeff, and our other partner, Ross Levine, who runs the real estate department with me, went out on our own about 11 years ago and have been trying to navigate through the streets of Manhattan, building a firm since then. We're still here and we're with you today. So hopefully that shows some signs of success and intelligence that I can hopefully impress upon all of you. That said, we have a firm that is somewhat diversified in the practice areas. I am strictly a real estate practitioner. I handle purchases, sales of co-ops, condos, townhouses, single-family residences, whatever they may be. I also do leasing, commercial leasing, and commercial acquisitions. But the vast majority of my practice is residential purchases and sales. So if anybody has any questions on that afterwards, feel free to approach me. I won't bite, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So the unique part about our firm is that we are not just strictly a real estate firm. Many firms, many of my colleagues out there in the industry practice simply one area of law, and that is all their firm does. There are many of us out there in the industry who practice strictly in this field, but the value added we have is that we have a litigation department that Jeff runs. And Jeff, when I became a lawyer back in 2003, Jeff was my direct report. He was my boss at the firm we started at. And we decided a few years later to hang a shingle, and Jeff came with, and here we are. So Jeff can tell you a little more about his practice, but what's great for us is that when there is a dispute that arises in a transaction, instead of farming it out to somebody else who may not be familiar with the client or the case itself, I can walk into Jeff's office and get advice on how to attack an issue so it doesn't get to litigation. And if it does get to litigation, Jeff's there to assist. That said, 50% of your practice is probably matrimonial law. And I'll let him tell you a little more about that and the interplay between real estate and divorce law, because there is a significant interplay. And you, as real estate agents, should certainly be cognizant of that, because there are many things you can do to get clients who may be going through a divorce or about to go through a divorce. And Jeff has some creative tips on doing that to assist you. So without further ado, Jeff.
Thank you, Sandy. As Sandy indicated, I'm one of the founding partners of Schwartz, Levine, and Kaplan, and I head up the firm's litigation arm, a significant portion of which is composed of contested matrimonial work. We were asked to speak today with respect to the topics of real estate as it relates to divorce. And I'm sure, as many of you professionals are aware, especially those who have gone through a situation where you have clients who are being divorced, it can pose a lot of very significant pitfalls, but it also poses a lot of significant opportunities. So what I'm going to try to do is give you the perspective of a matrimonial litigation attorney who goes through this process on an almost daily basis. And my perspective and what I offer to you will be what I think will be very helpful for you in not only identifying the obstacles and trying to avoid them, but also being cognizant of the opportunities that you can turn these situations into for yourself. Obviously, everybody who has gone through this situation before, whether it's personally or representing a client in the matrimonial context, realizes that you're dealing with two extremely stressed out individuals. If they have children, in many cases, you're dealing with more than two stressed out individuals. The issues that you're going to be facing with divorce clients that I know I face with my clients, and then I'm sure you'll face with individuals who you're going to represent, run the gamut from horrible emotional issues, financial stress, financial issues. If this involves a sale of their apartment, you're dealing with individuals who possibly see this as the greatest loss in their life, the sale of their dream home, which they're being forced to do. So in that context, you have to approach the situation, obviously, very sensitively. And I'm sorry if Sandy mentioned this already, because this is an interactive presentation. If anybody has any questions at any time, certainly feel free to raise your hand. We'll try to address those as we go along. It makes for a more interactive and, I think, helpful process.
And Jeff, let me just interrupt you while you're there. By show of hands in the crowd, has anybody ever had an exclusive where they had a divorcing couple? How much fun was that? Yeah. Does anybody have a war story they want to share, or, that was somewhat interesting that we could perhaps parlay from?
Yeah, sure. I actually had the opposite. I had a couple who came to sell the property.
Yeah.
And by the time we got into contract, they got back together.
Wow.
That's a happy story.
The fear of selling your dream home got you back together. Yeah. Oh, wow. Fresh beginnings, new start. Yeah.
Certainly. Well, that's interesting you would say that. It reminds me of what happened back in 2008, especially here in New York, where there were some changes to the market, obviously. And all of a sudden, people who thought that their home was worth X and found out it was really worth Y, even in the divorce context, were finding it easier, and I say that with quotations, to stay married at the time. So you saw situations where rather than sell the dream house, which was worth X hundreds of thousands of dollars less, let's stay married for a little bit longer, or we can't afford to be divorced. I've heard all those things before, so I guess you're right. Certain conditions do scare people back into their situations. So I have seen it before. So again, from a practice perspective, as far as the litigation side of my practice is concerned, one of the things that I've noticed for real estate professionals that they should be very, very aware of, and some of these things seem so commonsensical, but they're really not. And it starts really with your first interaction with a married couple. If you were the broker or the professional involved in the purchase of someone's apartment, be very careful not to play favorites with one of the spouses over the other. And I say this because I saw it come back in the most insidious fashion, where in a divorce context, you have to remember that there is very rarely a situation where the parties will agree on anything. And that includes the time of day, whether the sun is shining, and anything else you can possibly imagine. So you want to be very careful not to ever give one of the parties that you're representing in a purchase the feeling that the other party is somehow taking more of your time or getting your ear, because if these parties are going to become divorced in the future, it will come back to haunt you, because there will be a feeling by one of the spouses that, no, we're not going to use her, or we're not going to use him as our broker this time because you thought she was cute, or he thought you were sexy, or he wasn't listening to what I was saying when we were seeing the house, or so on and so forth. I've heard it a million times, and that will immediately eliminate you as a possible candidate as far as two divorcing spouses are concerned, if you seek to be responsible for the sale, if that is ever to come to pass. There's no quicker way to alienate an already disgruntled spouse in such a situation, so be very aware of that situation, and certainly that will make it much easier for you to obtain the transaction and certainly close it ultimately. Another thing I wanted to point out was it's very important to establish, and this is probably the most important factor, a good relationship with the lawyers who are representing the parties in the divorce. And the reason I say this is, beginning with the most obvious part of this, if you're called upon to show an apartment that belongs to divorcing spouses, there are countless examples of situations I can think of where one of the spouses who may not want the apartment to sell or isn't happy with the situation, which isn't hard to imagine, doesn't want you to show the apartment. And I can't begin to tell you how a disgruntled spouse can turn an otherwise beautiful apartment into a rotten mess that you as a real estate professional not only doesn't want to show, but can't show. I personally had situations where I represented a woman years ago whose spouse had exclusive occupancy of the apartment, not because a court awarded it, but because that's just, my client couldn't stand living there anymore and moved out. Left her spouse in the apartment, and then it was time to sell the apartment, and we engaged a real estate professional, which was a small miracle in and of itself. And then when we were finally able to get some showings scheduled, you can only imagine what this husband who didn't want the apartment sold did to the apartment. And I mean, everything from keeping it an absolute mess to clogging the plumbing in the toilets. At one point, I know that he parked his motorcycle in the living room. Just anything you can imagine. By maintaining good communication with both of the lawyers, you're able to actually circumvent some of those problems, because as a lawyer, if I'm in a situation where my client is trying to sell her apartment and there's a problem because her husband's causing it, and again, I should be using gender neutral terms here, so just everyone assume that if I say husband, I mean wife and vice versa. If I have a situation where the husband is somehow trying to prevent the orderly transaction and the orderly showing and the orderly sale of that apartment, and I get a call from the broker, I'm certainly going to become involved very quickly, not only to call the other lawyer, but to notify the court of this problem. And I can assure you that all the judges in the 5 counties that I practice in here in New York City are very quick to remedy those situations, and they will come down very swiftly and remedy the situation by something as simple as having the husband removed very promptly from the property, if that's the case, and you won't have that problem anymore.
And just let me elaborate on that a little bit, just from the real estate attorney perspective, and just paint a picture for you. How many times have any of you had a deal and you've tried to email the transactional attorney or call, get hung up on, get no response, and you're wondering where your deal is in like, when's the contract being signed? What's going on? When are they, what's the status of my deal, right? I mean, how often does that happen? So I encourage brokers to always contact me at the outset. I mean, most of my referrals for deals come from brokers, so I include them in the transaction itself and make sure that they're aware, step by step, methodically, of what's going on. But the same relates here. If call them, call the divorce attorney like Jeff's suggesting. Introduce yourself, send them an email, bring them a box of cookies, do something to establish yourself within their brain so that they're responsive to you if you need them, because they will be a big ally.
Bottle of wine works well.
Yeah. I usually go with Insomnia up on the Upper West Side.
So we talked a little bit about a situation where it's good to maintain that open communication with the lawyers. You want the lawyers to like you as the real estate professional. I certainly seek the help of real estate professionals who are called upon to sell these properties with respect to divorcing spouses, because as the divorce attorney, usually the situation is that they're selling the apartment because they have to. There's some huge financial stress, and the last thing you want is anything to delay that sale. So if you want to stay in your client's good graces as an attorney, you want to do everything you can to foster that. So we're going to seek to maintain a good communication level with realtors who are involved in the sales also. This also goes to a situation, I'm sorry.
Can I ask, there was a case that got involved because of New York State, which last year there were there was a copy that they did not agree in a number of brokers. I don't know what happened after. Because the one that the wife wanted, the husband said no. And when the husband wants, the wife said no, I don't want it. And they they both had ownership of the apartment, so both they had to sign from the appropriate broker. What's happening in this case? Is it?
So the question was, what happens when you have spouses who won't agree on what broker to engage for the sale of a property?
Sure. Well, there's no per se law that we can go to answer that situation. If there was, it'd be great. What normally happens in that situation is you bring it to the judge. And I've had that situation occur about 99.9% of the time. Realistically, when you're in the majority of my work as a divorce lawyer is very contested work, and I wasn't kidding when I said people can't agree on what time of day it is. Agreeing on a real estate broker, it's easier to part the sea. So what'll happen in most cases is that the judge will be called upon to make the decision, and that can go a couple of different ways. And that can involve a co-brokerage agreement where the husband wants this broker, the wife wants that broker, and as long as there's not some conflict of interest that a lawyer can articulate that makes sense, which may or may not exist, the judge could very likely say, you're both going to be the co-brokers, have at it, you're going to split the commissions, deal with it. In some circumstances, there is some sort of issue that comes up in court, because lawyers are very good at creating issues and crafting issues, that the judge will accept. And in that case, the judge, and we'll talk a little bit about this, goes to the list. And the list is a list maintained by the courts. Every judge in every part will have a list of acceptable brokers to the court that are neutral. And the judge will usually go down his list. And who's ever up next will be the broker on that deal, whether the parties like it or not. This is who the court appoints. Judge will draft an order. Have a nice day. Here's your order, counselor. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming out. Bye. Done.
Did everybody get that? So, I mean, that's a big point we always stress when we speak on this topic is...
How do I get on the list?
How do you get on the list? Everybody wants on the list.
Yeah.
So Jeff's had some creative suggestions in the past that...
Sure. Are there any lawyers in here before I before I go down that path? Okay, no lawyers. As I indicated, there are lists maintained by the courts, and getting yourself on that list is not always an easy endeavor. I don't know that there's any silver bullet that's going to get you on that list, but certainly it's probably starts with a phone call to the judge's clerk and some communication with the judge's clerk. Do not use my name if you call the court. We never had this discussion, but
Cookies.
Yeah, probably
They work great.
Probably a phone call from either yourself or some sort of a senior member of your office to the court clerk would be the way to start to get your name on that list. I can't say I've ever seen those lists. I know that they're in some cases extensive lists, especially in New York County and Kings County. I've had numerous brokers appointed where the parties can't agree in the past, and I just know that they're extensive lists. But getting on those lists is probably something everybody should consider to be a major opportunity in some major way to try to gain some advantage.
And we just had another
Certainly.
question back.
Sure.
I was actually going to ask the question, you answered it already, doing a co-broke between the wife and the husband's selected agents.
Yep. You do occasionally find a judge who has the wisdom to do something like that, but normally, depending upon, and I won't name judges or even counties, they're so fed up with the bickering and the arguing, the list comes out quite quickly. I actually know when he's going for the list. I'll tell my client he's going for the list, he's going for the list. And out comes the list.
We
So,
can probably suggest it ahead of time, right, before it even gets to a judge. Just
Sure.
say, listen, you're disagreeing.
Sure.
We can make this peaceable and you can both feel represented.
I agree. Good lawyers will have had that discussion before they even get to the courtroom, and we're both going to, be on the same page that, yeah, we're going to have the ceremonial fight because, remember, it's a divorce. You're being highly compensated by a highly sophisticated client who wants a show. And as lawyers, we're constantly running PR campaigns to our clients. And they want to see that you've made an attempt to at least, make that application, but then that quickly switches to, okay, judge, let's go to the list. And, the same thing applies not just with the selection of the broker, but the other major factor, how do we set the price? Where are we going to set the price? And I agree with you. I couldn't agree more. However, the other two individuals involved in the transaction, often who are real estate professionals, self-appointed, often, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, believe that they have a much better idea and a much better sense of what the market factors are, and they're going to set the price $1 million above what you think the market price is. And after 9 weeks of not only no showings and no activity whatsoever, then they circle back and usually sober up. Yeah, price sobriety.
I have a question on that, because then if the judge put them to the list and then they list it too high,
Right.
Is there an opportunity then for us to come in at that stage? Because there
Well,
could
you'd
be
be
frustration
surprised.
with that list go through.
You'd be surprised, usually, unless there's oftentimes when there's a valuation issue, someone who's thinking is going to order an appraisal rather quickly and work with a real estate professional if they want to save some money, because I'm very confident that you all, being sophisticated real estate professionals, can come up with that number just as easily as an appraiser. The appraiser we're going to need, obviously, in a situation where somebody's going to buy somebody out. But normally, I'm comfortable, and I hope my adversary, if I can reach that agreement with him, is comfortable letting you guys set the price based on your market analysis, and you're all capable of doing the research and figuring out how many apartments sold in the last year, at what price, and so on and so forth. It just saves so much time, and it allows you guys to do your job, get it marketed as quickly as possible, get it sold as quickly as possible, with as little delay and frustration as possible. So you will find situations, though, where clients still can't agree. So hopefully you've got the judge to include in his order of the selection of a broker. It will also be the broker's job to set the market price based on, whatever their brokerage, whether it's, one of the big boys or whoever it is, feels that it should be set at. And hopefully there'll be also a factor in there which allows the court to lower that purchase price if you're not having any activity, whether it's 2.5% or 5% per 90 days or whatever it is. But again, very important that you work with the lawyers and hopefully have that good communication with the lawyers so you can get that price set. At my own personal experience, I had a client and her husband who owned an apartment downtown. Of course, we went through all the problems of trying to select brokers, everything, all the nightmares I just discussed. We went through every single one of them and then arrived at the price. And of course, both the clients thought the apartment should have been listed at least $500,000 or $600,000 above what it was recommended by a very competent broker. And I think for the first 3 or 4 months, it was just an absolute waste of everyone's time. And then as soon as they allowed her, they took a step back and allowed her to set the price where it should have been set. People started coming to see the place, and you know how it works. And then it sold very quickly. So again, because I get to see this all from more of a macroeconomic perspective, it's so significant and so important. So stay close with the lawyer, work closely with the attorneys. Hopefully they're going to work closely with you. They should in most instances, and you'll find that, again, things are much smoother. You can avoid all these pitfalls, which you're going to face one way or the other. And hopefully you're dealing with a lawyer who respects what you guys do and lets you do your job and sort of stays out of it.
When you're representing sellers who are going through the divorce, are you representing both spouses, or in some cases is there a different attorney representing one of them?
No, in New York State, you're not permitted to represent both spouses in a matrimonial action, and certainly there's a conflict there as far as I'm concerned, even representing them both in a real estate transaction. You'll find situations where the spouses will agree either to use a third-party lawyer to represent them on the real estate transaction, or I've seen situations where one lawyer, if the matrimonial lawyers are familiar with one another and they get along well enough, one will allow the other to sort of interact during the transaction, because it's a relatively simple proceeding, especially in an office like mine, where I have real estate professionals who are capable of representing buyers and sellers. There have been situations where I'll tell my adversary, the other attorney on the case, listen, if you want one of the guys in my office to do it, it's fine. We're going to share the contract with you. We're going to share all the notifications. You'll be copied on every email. Sort of streamlines the transaction and allows us to, again, maintain that little bit of control. Again, there are some circumstances where it just won't happen and they'll have to go get a third-party attorney.
And I've actually been involved in deals where I've represented consenting spouses who have allowed us to represent them as the real estate attorney on the transaction. And I've also been the lawyer who has been called to represent someone who has their own counsel. Both spouses have their own individual counsel. Those are typically the interesting deals, because all money, after you pay off the mortgages and the broker, tend to go in escrow. So they can fight about it and then disperse. And sometimes funds sit there and you don't know what's going on. And it's our job as the attorney to have that money there when the parties finally settle it. But you can't release a penny. you know, without them both consenting. So it locks up the funds.
So when you have two real estate attorneys on the sales side and you're doing a co-broke, is one of those two attorneys functioning as the lead so that the buyer's aid,
Usually,
has one?
Yeah, I mean, I would strongly recommend that there's one point person running the show.
Right.
And like Jeff said, if we were to share comments and share the contract, et cetera, before it goes to the buyer's attorney, let's say, that's fine, but there should always be one person running point, or else it'll just muddy the waters
Right.
immensely.
Two completely separate contract reviews by two sellers, just is what we call a fiasco.
Yeah. A question back there, yes.
Isn't it more common to have a co-exclusive than a co-broke when it's two different, like,
That's what.
I think that's what it meant, yeah.
you're talking about co-exclusives, no?
Yes, correct.
So one final point I wanted to make with respect to avoiding pitfalls, and this is more of a sort of a proactive stance that real estate professionals should be aware of. There are certain instances where I believe the realtor involved in a transaction can sort of act as a tiebreaker between two feuding attorneys, and I've had this happen before, where you have two attorneys who are at least somewhat reasonable, which is, again, an exception, but there can be an instance where when the attorneys are talking about a decision that has to get made regarding the sale of a residence in a divorce situation, where you can turn to the broker and say, well, you know, why don't we ask her, or why don't we ask him? And it's very important to be, again, someone who appears to be neutral, whether you've been appointed by a court or whether by some miracle you've been allowed to act as the broker by two divorcing spouses. But really, be cognizant of the fact that you carry, you know, a significant amount of power and have the ability to sometimes act as the tiebreaker. I had a situation where, and again, it's always terribly difficult situations involving terribly sophisticated concepts like what time can we show the apartment? And of course, the lawyer that I was working with couldn't agree with me that the apartment should be shown at, 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning, because of course no one in New York City is awake at 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Why would you want to suggest such an early hour in the morning to show the apartment? Terribly unreasonable. So my difficulty obviously was trying to get someone in there to show the apartment. Someone was very eager to purchase the apartment at the time, and the husband just wasn't willing to allow him in at 11 o'clock. So we decided that, you know what, let's have this lovely broker who's working on this case, make this final decision. And if she says it's okay with her, let's do it. And of course, we made the phone call, just called her out of the blue, and she said, yes, 11's perfect. As a matter of fact, I've got a full schedule the rest of the afternoon. It's the only time I could do it. So it wouldn't have happened, though, if I couldn't convince my adversary that the broker on this case was a neutral professional who would give us, in this case, her reasonable, considered opinion, and again, allow us to do something as simple as show an apartment at 11 o'clock in the morning. But again, it was a major problem just to try to get something that simple done. So those are some of the situations that I think, if you're aware of, you can take advantage of and try to move the transaction along a lot smoother.
I'm not sure I understood the example, because you said that the seller, the husband in this case, did not want it shown at 11.
Right, they were divorcing spouses. The husband was there exclusively.
But it was resolved because the broker said they could show it?
Sure, it was something as simple as just a scheduling disagreement. I think the husband said, no, come at 5:30 in the afternoon.
And you were able to get him to agree later on that 11 was?
Right, the people who wanted to see it had indicated to us that 11 o'clock was the only time they were traveling or something. I forget what this exact scenario was, but they had to be in there early in the morning.
I just don't understand how the husband was finally convinced.
By calling his lawyer,
Yeah,
and then saying, call the broker.
Right.
Agreeing to call the broker.
Right. There are certain circumstances where you have to, as a divorce attorney, have control over your client. And if I call my client up and have a discussion with him or her about letting the broker in at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the response I get is, well, that's not going to work because the dog is sleeping, my response is generally, they're coming at 11.
Because then they're going to make an application to the court to mandate that they
Right.
show it, and that's going to cost you $5,000 when a motion's filed. So,
10,000.
so open up the door at 11 o'clock and let them in. That's usually how it goes. Yeah.
Oh, sure. It's a much bigger problem than a lot of people, I'm sure, realize.
Yeah.
So, again, you want to make sure that you recognize the opportunities that are available to you in staying very neutral in these circumstances. Do not let one divorcing spouse for a second think that you're paying more attention to the other divorcing spouse. Now, I know this is a rare example, but if you were lucky enough to represent these two individuals when they were happily on their way to matrimonial or had been recently married, you've already gotten that purchase. And if you're lucky enough to have remained in their good graces and they're divorcing, unfortunately, and you're the broker who's selected to be responsible for that transaction, you're going to get them on the sale. And I actually had a situation where they both spun off after their sale, and they both used the same broker on 2 more purchases, which is, again, a rare example. But if you're able to maintain those types of relationships, you could potentially have 4 transactions out of that kind of a thing. Another thing that I think you should be aware of is there are several identifying factors that I've noticed over the years which sort of jump out to me that I think you should be aware of. When you're representing people who are newlyweds, for example, I don't know what the exact statistics are because they fluctuate a little bit, and I'm told now that the divorce rate is actually a little bit lower in New York. I don't have the actual New York City statistics, but in New York State generally, the rate of divorce is coming down just a little bit. But I've noticed, just in my own personal career over the decades that I've been a divorce lawyer, that there are a fair amount of new marriages that people rush into the purchase of a home that don't always go so well. And usually in a matter of 9 months to 16 months, I see a fair portion of those turn into, unfortunately, matrimonial situations. So you have to be cognizant of that at all times when you're showing an apartment to newlyweds. Certainly, this is very obvious. I'm sure you all recognize the opportunities that newlyweds also propagate and have children. And certainly that's going to have some very, very obvious implications if they have purchased a 1-bedroom or a studio, and certainly they're newlyweds and they're going to have children. Well, that's going to pose some issues that you want to be there for. The basics, obviously. Something else that has occurred to me over the years, be on the lookout for major renovations. Nothing kills a good marriage better than a major house renovation. And I knew that there'd be some snickers when that was said, but to bring up a war story, I had a situation where a client of mine in a matrimonial situation, and her spouse had built what I can only describe as a dream home mansion in one of the northern counties. And that nightmare of a project turned obviously into a matrimonial situation. I know that the spouse who I represented actually had an affair with one of the gentlemen who was involved in the construction of the home. And this really turned into a nightmare. So be on the lookout for people building mansions, major renovations to apartments, things like that. Believe it or not, those things do cause a tremendous amount of stress on a family situation, and I've identified that as a factor that comes into play with marital difficulties, and unfortunately it does lead to divorce situations. And I always tell my clients that you never should have renovated that kitchen.
Yes, I just wanted to guess that perhaps there's less divorces because there's less marriages.
It's probably a good point. You know, with the number of marriages down, certainly it leaves a smaller pool of marriages. But I guess when you consider the length of certain marriages, there's still a pretty healthy pool around. I find myself tremendously busy with matrimonial work, and very few of the divorces that I've started in my career actually end up in a reconciliation. They're usually on their way south. And I also notice there's a fair percentage of contacts that I get, because as a divorce lawyer, generally you don't get a phone call that says, I'm coming into, well, I actually get those calls. Generally a matrimonial contact starts with a phone call where someone's inquiring, wants some information about a divorce, I'm going through a bad situation, and I'm going to think about it, talk to 9 other lawyers, and I'll get back to you. And how much do you charge? So usually you don't hear back for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but generally when you do hear back, things didn't get better, they've only gotten worse, and now it's really bad, and now there's motions and domestic violence issues or what have you related to the situation. So it's a situation where you usually receive a little contact and then it goes south. What period of time passes between that first contact, and it varies quite a bit though.
Just a point you mentioned, Jeff, also on the newlywed issue. Just remember who your client is too when you have a young couple or not so young couple and you're taking them out and showing them an apartment to see or a home to see. I had a situation where I was representing a young couple and I happened to know them personally, and the husband was the one purchasing the home. They were not married yet. They were going to be married in a few months. And the question was raised in a group email, do I want to put so-and-so on the deed as well? And I just said, offline, call me. I had to have that conversation because remember, they were not married. So he was the one providing the funds for the purchase. So notwithstanding my personal relationship with them, I had a client and I had to consult him and advise him, listen, it's you. Post-marriage, do what you want, but right now it's you. So, also, Jeff, you handle a lot of these situations through prenups or mid-nuptial agreements, stuff of that nature. I mean, you can always memorialize it in an agreement afterwards, but why? Why go through it? It's a lot easier to just change a deed than it is to have a whole post-nuptial agreement drafted. So just food for thought there. Just remember who your client is.
Again, what's a mid-nuptial and post-nuptial agreement? How does anybody come to these agreements?
Sure. Mid-nuptial or post-nuptial is just the definition we give to an agreement you've entered after the date of your marriage. Prenuptial, or what we call now an antenuptial agreement, is the premarital agreement, where you negotiate and have more of a negotiating power.
Right, that's why I can't think of the other one. Who would agree?
Well, plenty of people, for example, the Uncle Tommy dies and leaves you $1 million. You take Uncle Tommy's money and you go buy something with it. Well, it came through your family, so sometimes somebody wants to protect that money for their family, their side of the family, per se. So, that may be a circumstance where if a property's acquired or something happens to that money you invested somewhere, that some post-nuptial agreement may have to be drafted.
Yeah, I'm finding a lot of this, people moving in together, not actually getting married, combining finances in a very murky manner, and then it not working out. And sometimes I'll call it the big M. It's not the big marriage, it's the big mortgage,
Yep.
And I'm doing the same thing as you every now and again, even with a rental. I'm like, you don't need both to qualify for this. Put it under one person, have the other as a legal resident. But I guess it's better to do it this way for them.
Right. We see a lot of those issues. We live in a pretty big town here, so we see more than probably a lot of the rest of this country sees, and the different types of arrangements that have come across. I know my desk over the years is just mind-boggling, especially now. We certainly live in an age with same-sex marriages, and it's just really. I was going to mention, this kind of goes back to this gentleman's question here. There are more marriages, fewer total marriages, but more combinations of individuals who are marriable, eligible to be married, and certainly that opens up a lot of other interesting areas for lawyers like myself, who again have to negotiate in some circumstances before the marriage, whether it's a prenuptial agreement or during the marriage, a mid-nuptial or post-nuptial, and certainly after or near the end of the marriage when it's a settlement agreement or a separation agreement, if that's the case. And again, we live in such a small world now where we have international people who have homes in, 5 different places and international. And I find myself drafting agreements now that incorporate the home in London, the home in Brazil, the home in Spain, the home in Italy. Where's my Italian home? I don't. But you do see a tremendous amount of different scenarios and factors that come into play with all of these different arrangements. So we draft these agreements on a daily basis.
Yeah. Now it makes more sense to me than the other nuptial agreements, especially when you add in a whole new changes to marriage, right?
Yeah. What I see a lot with the post-nuptial agreements where the individuals are not going to get divorced or aren't sure if they want to get divorced, it's more of a either test the waters, or I see it used as not a threat, but more as a, well, I'm going to get divorced, but maybe I won't if you sign this agreement. But that calls into question, whether you're signing it under duress and whether there was some overreaching, and those issues come up quite a bit too. So everyone is encouraged to certainly have an attorney. You don't want to sign any of these agreements without a lawyer. You don't want to negotiate, draft, or get involved in these agreements without your lawyer explaining to you all the legal impact of everything, especially if it involves certainly life's most probably precious asset, which is your home here in New York City.
Do you guys handle trust law at all?
With respect to estate matters and trust law, we handle the litigation side of it. If there's a fight over the trust, that is something we represent individuals with respect to. I'm engaged in litigations in surrogates court over trusts all the time. However, we don't do the actual drafting of wills. We leave that to the professionals to do that. And the reason for that is usually those matters will involve some rather sophisticated tax questions, taxation issues, especially for residents of New York City, where your net worth is above a certain level. So we work very closely with the professionals who draft those types of documents, whether they're trusts or simple wills. But certainly we would refer that out to a professional who specializes in just those types of areas. And again, the major reason being tax consequences. The estate tax laws have changed so radically in the last couple of years. You really have to have a very competent professional advise you with respect to that stuff. But if it's a situation, again, involving litigation, fighting over the trust for some reason, that we do. We like a good fight.
You do. I like closing the deal.
So with that said, I think we've covered our areas, but certainly we want to open up to any other questions anybody has while we're here. We're happy to stay as long as you guys want, or if somebody has a question they'd rather come up and ask us individually, that's fine too. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.